had to endure as a student in Germany in the 1660s and 70s. One of his contemporaries in particular can help us to understand him better. This is the jurist Christian Thomasius, almost an exact contemporary. Now, at first sight, he doesn't look like our Philadelphian. The elegantly coiffed Thomasius summoned his fellow German professors to learn to behave as if they were French courtiers. Well, that was a lost cause. But he still seems quite different from Pastorius, the Quaker-inspired believer in equality with his love of fishing and gardening in the country. But the two men shared a great deal. They were both raised as jurists, and they belonged to a wave of learned lawyers who set out in the later 17th century to reform the law and the institutions that sustained it. Both were influenced by Philipp Jakob Spener and rejected Lutheran orthodoxy in favor of a religion of the heart. Both were steeped in learning, and both saw the universities as needing both to be challenged and at their best to be preserved. So Thomasius, for example, lectured in German as well as in Latin, a very shocking step to take, but also kept on writing in German and speaking to the learned. Now, Thomasius argued that the only rational way to respond to the vast seas of information that in his view had overwhelmed people like Kircher and made them incapable of critical thought was to stand against them and to master them, to learn to think critically about them. His view, for example, of philosophy was that each sect offered possibilities. The sensible person must learn to be a rational eclectic, and there you see the rational eclectic being taught by Thomasius at the bottom, to make a reasonable choice between Stoics, Platonists, and Aristotelians. Not a choice of one school, but a choice of the useful parts from each of them. And Thomasius's followers, Thomasius's friends and followers, for he was extraordinarily charismatic, turned this program for reforming learning into a program of compilation, which in its style is discernibly similar to that of Pastorius. They collected on a scale that beggars belief. One professor would give a lecture course on all of learning. Another professor would lecture on the first professor's course, filling the bottom of each page with an enormous sea of footnotes, which sustains a tiny island of text. Students would interleave their copies and take further notes when the next professor lectured. The greatest of these single works, a history of erudition by Nicolaus Gundling, was 7,700 quarto pages long. The index alone was more than 900 pages. So this is a world of compilation. It looks, as Pastorius looks, a bit mad. The carousel spins and the polyhistors heap learning on it and heap learning on it. But in fact, as Martin Giel has shown in a wonderful book, this is highly purposeful activity. The point of it is to take all of this information, sort it, bring it together, and make it accessible to critical thought and critical determination. Thomasius, in fact, unwisely even invited his readers to do the same to his own books. Most of us begin our books with prefaces in which we thank our friends for reading and correcting them, and then say they, of course, are not responsible for any of the errors, by which, of course, we mean the opposite. They are responsible for all of the errors. Thomasius, by contrast, begins his book by saying, there will be lots of errors, please tell me about them, so that the second edition can be absolutely better. If you had email it out, you'd done it. This is a world in which the standard visual allegory of the title page of these compilations is one of enlightenment in darkness. The thread that can lead you, as one of these works shows, to the heart of the labyrinth. If you look at Pastorius, having looked briefly at Thomasius, the similarity becomes clear at once, and the buzzing polyglot surface of the beehive gives way to reveal the deeper motives that underlay its creation. Now, Pastorius wanted to do lots of things as he sat and wrote and wrote. He was mastering English for himself and his sons, he was studying alchemy, but above all, he was trying to provide the material for critical thought. As he himself says at the beginning of the notebook, reader, he says, be my corrector, cut what's superfluous, and deign to add the truths that are lacking to the truths that are here. And then he quotes naturally Francis Bacon, also a hero of Thomasius's, read not to contradict, nor to believe, but to weigh and consider, Francis Bacon. So both men are treating erudition not as a stock of material to be passively drawn on a kind of cultural bank account, but as a challenge to the reader's intelligence, as if, to use an ancient metaphor, it's a vast mass of currency, coins, some of it fake, some of it real, and the reader is to be the money changer who can, with his skill, tell the real from the false. Erudition in this world is a critical tool. So when Pastorius pursued erudition, he was doing so in a rational and calculated way. It did many things for him. One central one was to create relationships. Latin was still the language of the Republic of Letters in the Holy Roman Empire. Latin was still a language that rang bells with people that mattered to Pastorius. For example, his friend James Logan, who loved his Latin books and with Pastorius' Latin notes. And here you have a very affectionate note by Logan recording his acquisition of one of Pastorius' books. Latin made a friendship for Pastorius with Thomas Lloyd, a Quaker who became one of his close friends in Pennsylvania and whose children he mentored in the study of Latin and the classics. Above all, Latin made a connection with William Penn. Pastorius knew Penn and did business with him, but it was when Penn came to visit him in his first little house in Germantown that the friendship really took off. It was a tiny house, 30 shoes long, says Pastorius, 15 shoes wide, with oiled paper windows for lack of glass. But Pastorius, of course, never stopped writing Latin. And when he ran out of space in his books, he wrote Latin on his house, on the windows, on the chests, and in this case, over the door, where he wrote, "It's a little house, but it's friendly. Be far away, profane men." Penn came, he saw the motto, and he laughed. The sources differ. Some say it was the only time in his life that he ever laughed. Some say that it was one of the 2 times in his life that he laughed. I think he, rather like us, thought Pastorius had made a rather bad joke, but he loved he in some way just loved the pretentiousness of the Virgilian inscription on the hut in the New World. And it was after he saw it that the 2 men began a life of rides and conversations that would last until Penn left Philadelphia. But learning did something more important than spinning notework, something connected with it, but more important. Learning was really good to think with. Thomasius made really productive use of learning. It was his learning that enabled him to write the great tracts in which he condemned prosecuting people for witchcraft and using torture to wring testimony from witnesses. Pastorius used his learning in a dramatically similar way. On the 12th of February, 1688, Pastorius and 3 friends examined the custom of slaveholding, which many of their fellow Quakers were accepting and practicing, and they denounced it. This famous Germantown